Tricia, are there still? Okay, we're going to wait about another minute. Get our other participants in the hall. Okay, as people are taking their seats, we're going to resume. Welcome back our streaming audience. I did neglect to mention that we are having a film crew from the Knight Foundation interview people here and there, and so if we've given you a little time to meet with them, we hope you'll be able to do so. It's right outside the room. Okay, so the idea was to start with essentially a status check on what are we talking about with open governance. We even have a map of it. We delved into it. We've gone over what are our goals in using technology to enhance the engagement of citizens with their governments, and all various themes that came out in the morning. And we think it's now appropriate to turn to an institution in the UK, United Kingdom, that has attempted to kind of pull together these various themes and put them into a single organization called the Open Data Institute. And we're pleased to welcome Gavin Starks to just give us an overview, and it will be a general overview because we're going to actually get to go in further depth tomorrow on it. An overview with the idea of let's be looking at what they're doing and seeing what is the analog. We know that we can't incorporate or import, or I don't think maybe we could, an Open Data Institute and just put it in the U.S., but what are the analogs in the U.S.? How do we think about how we institutionalize some of these functions? So, Gavin?
Thank you, Charlie. Well, I'd like to tell you the story of the ODI so far. My name's Gavin Starks. I'm the chief exec. We started 9 months ago on the 1st of October. So this is going to be a very whirlwind tour of some of the things we've done in the last 9 months to give you a flavor of what we're doing. But to set some context, I think I see this very much, my pattern recognition it's a bit like 1995 all over again with the web of documents. Everybody was very excited, everybody saw lots of potential, but nobody quite knew what it meant, and we had no idea what would be happening over the next 20 years. And if you look back now and say, well, how much did that impact us? Well, quite a lot. And so open data, from my point of view, is an emerging web of data which can have the same level of impact as the web of documents has done over the last 20 years. So it's not really a category. It sits underneath a whole emerging ecosystem of actors. So when we look then at who this is for, well, my view is that this is for everyone. And we're very fortunate to have Sir Tim Berners-Lee as one of our co-founders. This is a screen grab from the Olympics this year, where he tweeted out, this is for everyone from the center of the stage. And when we look at this on a grand level, we look at open data helping us to address some of the greatest challenges of our time and generating value for everyone. This is our mission statement. And we don't say this lightly, and we define value as economic value, as social value, and as environmental value. So we're trying to bring a flavor of triple bottom line impact assessment to what we're doing. One of the catalysts to this, well, we're looking at a new era where the G8 have signed up to an open data charter. And just a few weeks ago, this was signed up to at the G8 meeting by the world leaders, and we're starting to see this really accelerate across a whole range of different countries and initiatives. Today I'm just going to give you a quick flavor of the ODI. We'll talk more tomorrow about specifics about how we can expand, but just in terms of the UK team, we've got Sir Tim Berners-Lee. We also have Sir Nigel Shadbolt, who's going to be joining us tomorrow. We have an exceptional leadership team, particularly with Jenny Tennyson, our technical director, who is a world leader really in open data and linked data, and helped to create legislation.gov.uk and sits on the W3C boards with Sir Tim. We see a global opportunity. We don't see this as a UK-centric thing at all. I think within minutes of really starting to think about the scale of this. We see global political support, whether it's the OGP, Open Government Partnership countries, whether it's the US executive order, and we see dozens of countries, hundreds of cities and regions around the world launching their own data portals. So there is a push to publish, so generating more data supply. We also see international commitments, not just the Open Data Charter, but the World Bank opening up its contracting information. And we see a global Gov 2.0 landscape, which is broadening. It's not just public sector teams and grassroots, but it's also commercial engagement increasing. And I'll give you some flavors of this. Now, the Open Data Institute is a non-profit. We sit outside of government. That's quite an important point. We sit outside of government, and part of our remit is to hold government to account on its commitments to open data. But what we have done is help to bridge between the public sector, private sector, third sector. We have a 2-year program with the World Bank to train the world's political and national leaders. And in the last 9 months, we've helped to unlock a substantial amount of funding. We have $15 million ourselves over the next 5 years to run the organization. We raised $750,000 from the Amidyar network, but we also engaged directly with the funding community and with the commercial sector. We've unlocked over $3 million for startups. We've actually secured $750,000 of commercial membership fees for the organization. So these are companies like Virgin Media, Rackspace, NTT, Quantum Computing, coming to us wanting to open up their own information, not just use government data, but bring their own data to the table as well. So this is about the broadening of horizons here. How can we stimulate innovation across the board? We've had some amazing feedback, and I love talking about our users. You know, people like VC investors who believe that we're cultivating new leaders and champions in this space, that we've been an island of hope in a sea of data apathy, is something we heard from some of the commercial sector, and that we're giving people the opportunity to iterate. So as was mentioned earlier, we need to be agile, we need to be able to fail fast. This is really quite a core philosophy of what we're trying to achieve. What have we done in the last 9 months? Well, we've had over 3,000 visitors to our space. We've got a 5,000 square foot office in the centre of Shoreditch in London. And having a space has had a huge impact. We've brought together people like My Society, the Open Knowledge Foundation, Open Government Partnership, the corporate sector, artists, hackers, into the same space to really innovate. I've had 25 countries ask me how can they set up their own ODI. Now, we'll talk more about that tomorrow, but I think how we answer that question is one conversation I want to begin here, and I'd love to have some direction on that before we leave. We've got 20 corporate paying members. We've launched 6 courses. These are short courses like Open Data for Journalists, Open Data for Lawyers. And we've got 10 startups that we're incubating. Now, we don't take any equity stake in them, but we provide them with mentoring, we help them unlock information, and we help connect them with customers. And 3 of the organizations that we've been incubating have secured 6-figure investments or contracts in the last 6 months. We're very grateful to the support from around the world as well. Apparently, we have a lot of fans in very significant places, and we're very famous in Korea, which was a bit of a surprise. But this is reflective of a global shift in culture. We're also very delighted that the city of Raleigh has started to adopt some of the work that we've been doing and copying it themselves. So I'd say some of the work we're doing is already in the US, and I'll talk more about that later. But let me talk about some real tangible examples. So one of the first projects we got involved with, there was a startup, Open Healthcare Trust, and some doctors involved in looking at the prescriptions data in the UK. They took all of the open data related to one drug class called statins, and they looked at how much money could you save if you switched from patented drugs to off-patent drugs. removing all the clinical exceptions. So this is after you've done analysis to take out those clinical use cases where the patented drugs are required. And on one drug class, it was a $300 million a year potential saving. We then put some marketing and communications behind that, so we got it covered in the Financial Times, The Economist, and told the story broadly across the UK. It then went international. I've heard people refer to it in the G8 reports, in reports to the Japanese government, and in the US. So the fact that these stories exist, we've demonstrated they do exist, we can find them. The fact that we can communicate them globally exists. It also speaks to the fact that there are not enough good stories, and this is something that was echoed, I think, earlier. But telling really compelling stories, $300 million potential saving is huge. If you apply this to all the drug classes, it could be a $1.5 billion or $2 billion saving for the UK Health Service. Now, that's tens of thousands of nurses. So let's change the language you're using into what is the impact that we're really trying to achieve here. And I think one of the challenges there, and one of the interesting parts of this story, is getting the coverage, identifying the potential is the beginning of the story. We've then helped the startup that we're incubating secure a further $150,000 worth of funding to build this out as a software as a service analytics business that they can provide behavior change systems and try and actually bring the number down. And because the data is released as open data, we'll be able to track that on a monthly basis. Second example, which is just launched today, is with Open Corporates, who we also incubate at the ODI. And they've done beneficial mapping of all the companies in the US. The particular announcement today is around beneficial ownership of all the US banks, but it also extends to companies like IBM, Starbucks, and so on. So starting to use this information and draw in new audiences. So this is getting coverage not just in Wired, but in the financial press. Interestingly, the US press has been a bit hesitant to cover this. I'm not entirely sure why, but I'm sure people around the room can help us engage more directly with some of the US press in getting this covered. I want to come back to this idea of cultural shift. One of the very first things we did was we actually launched a data-driven art commission. That might seem like an unusual thing to do for a new institute, but we gave people 2 weeks to respond, and we had 89 responses from over 20 countries in those 2 weeks. We then went on to get coverage in the Wall Street Journal, and the commission itself was featured at the main TED conference in LA. Again, with 3,000 people visiting our space, that's changed the perceptions of what people think data is. And the sculpture here on the right-hand side is bringing in real-time data from around London, environmental data, sound levels, pollution levels, etc., and bringing them back into an experiential, quantified self. So there's a significance here for our cultural leadership. So when we think about who is everyone in this context, it's not just citizens, it's not just our governments, it's the corporate sector, it's our cultural sector, the third sector. So what's our role in this? Well, open data, the open data movement has been going for more than a decade. Our role is to help catalyze its evolution. And we catalyze the evolution of open data culture as a very specific way of trying to be inclusive of everyone. In terms of how we measure our own impact, we look at reach, engagement, and impact. Structured evidence, inspiring stories, events. We've got a summit later this year in October. We provide training, we provide direct research, and we've been developing standards, interfacing that directly with the demand side. So working with the commercial sector, working with startups to try and demonstrate what is possible. One of the earlier comments was that report cards work as an instrument. And one of the things that we identified as missing was a way of certifying open data. So at the G8 meeting a few weeks back, we launched open data certificates, which are the first robust quality badge for open data to help publishers understand how to publish quality open data, to help users understand and find it, and to help policymakers benchmark. This is something we've launched in the UK. It has 4 tiers, ranging from raw right up to expert. And expert we define as an exceptional example of information infrastructure. Again, this is trying to speak to the fact that this is a ubiquitous new infrastructure that we're trying to catalyze. We've had such interest of this, we've actually pre-generated the templates now for every country in the world, and we'll have a US-specific version of this by the end of this month. So we're very keen to engage with people on developing this and taking it forward. And I think when I look at what is happening globally, we see global demand, we have the Open Data Charter, emerging standards, investment in open, the venture community coming forward, we have government leadership, we have the third sector engaging, and we have a global community. So one of the challenges I'd like to set is that by the end of our sessions on Saturday, that we have some direction as to how can we create a global network of open data institutes as a distributed network. Many parts loosely joined, I think, would be the underlying principle, so that it can't be an export model, it has to be locally grown, and I'd love to see engagement across the US and across the world. Thank you very much.
So we get into comments, and then what I want to do is call on Story to talk about what it's like dealing as we, well, let me just go straight to you. What would you like to see, how do you envision the analog of ODI in the United States? Do you see an Open Data Institute US, or some other name, but not, as you said, not an export model? Do you laid out the idea of multiple organizations, and what do you think, from your perspective, you're saying you're looking at 25 countries. What do you see as the need in another country, and such as the United States? We don't need to go country by country because we really do want to focus on the US. What do you see as the vision that you would imagine coming out of the US?
I think the are ubiquitous, and they're not actually specific to the UK or to the US or any one country. One of the most common things we hear is, where do we start? So there is an absolute need for training. How do we increase data literacy? One of the reasons we created, again, all of our courses are open and designed to be repurposed for different territories. Open data for journalists, open data for lawyers starts to reach outside of the technology communities. We're also helping to train the civil service, public sector, and the private sector in our mission. So building capabilities is critical, and that begins with training, and that training has to be an iterative process, and it has to be something that we combine our resource on. In terms of standards development, I think the open data certificates are a great example. We've had just huge support from the community, and all of our development from day one has been done in the open. Everything we do has been done in the open from the outset. So I think in terms of how do we create an appropriate model for the US, well, I think I would certainly love to see multiple ODIs existing. We're already seeing this in the UK, not just London, but Manchester or Glasgow or Edinburgh want to have their own local node. So how can we facilitate that quickly without getting in the way, most importantly? But when I come back to this many parts loosely joined principle, I could see potentially, some of our thoughts are maybe we have a 3-tier structure. One is anybody can engage. There might be a second tier where people can engage commercially, and a third tier which is a lead country node. These are the kinds of conversations I really want us to be having over the course of the next couple of days. We've got some thoughts, but we haven't designed anything we've done in a vacuum so far, and we're not about to start. So we're really keen to collaborate and find out what are the local needs, what are the ways that we can help to catalyze existing groups and bring together the idea of having many goals or shared goals in a network that is enabled to have autonomy, but enabled to come together around potentially a grand challenge. We've picked finance as our lead challenge for this year. It doesn't mean we're not doing health or we're not doing transport, etc. But to try and focus and galvanize a community, picking a big impact or picking a big problem to solve helps people to think outside of their territory, outside of their organizational boundaries, outside of their country boundaries. So I'd really love to see the joining together of people who are experts, who can help bring communities together, whether they're sitting in the public sector or the private sector or as citizens.
So 3 words you used with open data I thought were interesting and telling. One, you said the open data culture. And by the way, just another plug, there is a art exhibit down in the basement here of quite interesting data art, or the art of data, I guess. Second, you used the word movement as and I think people here at least identify, and maybe the people, and certainly the people who are online, but that, we're really part of a global movement that we're talking about. And third, used more recently, is the network. And, that it does need to be in a network structure. And I think as we move along, we can be thinking about all those and the importance, where open data sits in our culture, in our political spheres, and in our lives. So I think that's very interesting. Max, you had a comment. Let's get
so in 2011 now, I did a Code for America fellowship, and at the time, it was the first year, and nobody really knew what Code for America would end up being good at. And in my opinion, the thing that Code for America does is similar to what the Open Data Institute does, not specifically focused on data, that's one of the many things under the umbrella, but it's the network and it's the people. And the first year we were there, 2011, it was 5 of us in City Hall. Joel was there as well. And now there's one of the fellows from that year works there full-time on the city. One of the projects he does, Go project, which is a food truck that actually is just a city office that moves around, so you can go and pay your water bill, ask about starting a new business, and it comes to your neighborhood. And there's another former fellow who's doing map and geospatial innovation in City Hall, and so they've realized that they could hire people that are more innovative into City Hall, and that's a pretty cool thing to see. But the biggest thing is the culture change, and it's really hard and it's really slow. And after Code for America, I always wondered, who do you call? Like, who are you going to call Ghostbusters? You can't call anyone in the United States and say, these are the open data people that will come to your city and talk you through it and make sure that there's no threat, there's no, don't even use the word risk, there is no risk, it's open data. Or if there is risk, mitigate the risk, figure out, here's the other cities that have done it right. There's nobody to handhold in the United States, and I see that something like the Open Data Institute could be such an awesome centralizing power for that. There's also a former Code for America guy, Mark Head, that's a chief data officer, and that's a pretty cool role. If we could see more chief data officers, that's basically their job inside of cities as well. Because I'm not gonna go sit in a sales meeting and try to convince a city employee to not go with Salesforce and instead go with something that has open APIs. But that's what needs to happen to move these things forward, and it's a messy job. I wanna keep hacking on tools that make the technology problems go away, but that social problems are also pretty big.
Great. I'd like to come back on one really significant point there, is that there's a delineation between the data and the application. And a lot of organizations, Code for America, Government Digital Service in the UK, are very much focused on building citizen-facing services that are better, right? And that's a really important function. We see a much broader and sort of more backroom approach of saying, well, that's one application, but how do we get this same information out into the commercial sector? How do we get it out into the third sector? How does it come back as a loop in uninformed policy? And that's a very different, right, it includes a different set of functions to just building the kind of citizen-facing services. And I think when I look at some of the impacts we've had of people just walking in and seeing, 2-person startup in our space, the fact that we exist as a centralized, this is where it is happening, gives confidence to people to actually spend money with a startup. And that has a huge impact on the network as a whole.
Andrew Stott.
I just want to say that I think that the real value of the ODI isn't so much in the centralizing that's being talked about, but in the catalyzing. And Gavin's presentation brought out a number of other organizations which work with the ODI, acting as the incubator for startups, the ODI launching initiatives and bringing other people into those. It's not a sort of one ring to rule them all, but actually catalyzing, focusing a whole set of activities that are going on.
Good. Ellen Miller from Sunlight.
Tell us a bit more about the certificate programs. Are you certifying individual data sets? Are you certifying companies? Are you certifying agencies in government? and all of the above is probably not the best answer. So what are your priorities, and what does it mean to have a certificate?
Okay, great. We certify specific data sets. So it's a certification program at the moment. I think there's plenty of commercial opportunity. If other people want to go and build certification businesses around this, great. The types of questions that are asked in that process are, what is the URL? What are the licensing conditions? Who owns the data? Who do I contact when it goes wrong? So the social information is baked into this as well. And one of the questions that I particularly like is, how long is this data going to exist for? Are you going to keep it up to date for the next year, or the next 2 years, or 3 years? Because that has a material impact on my ability to invest in it as a startup, or in fact anybody looking to use that information. So we're trying to codify the information that users of the data need in order to work out what it is, where to find it, and how to use it. And those questions, we've already had feedback. This has only existed in the sort of wild, really, for about 3 weeks. The feedback we've had is that the data publishers are saying, oh, this is great. We now understand what we need to do A, B, and C to make our data more usable. And this is including legislation Gov UK, it includes the police force in the UK, as well as private companies.
Okay. Stefaan Verhulst.
Yeah, no, I think the idea of a network of networks, or a platform that allows for connection of multiple efforts, is very compelling, and I think it's highly needed in the current environment in order to really leapfrog and actually push the potential of beyond the current composition of availability of data in some kind of form. And I think in order to do so well, I think we probably need to have two efforts, whether it's today or whether it's in the near future. One effort is to really identify functions that a network of network would be able to fulfill, going from, for instance, a community of experts that can provide technical assistance on demand, for instance, which would be awesome to have, to training, to sharing best practices, to ultimately also actually developing data applications, to and so on and so on. I mean, I'm not going to be comprehensive here, but I think it's going to be important to start tossing those functions out. That's one. Two would then be interesting to see, well, what is already on the map with regard to those functions, and how can you actually start, as opposed to just reinvent, start at the moment already to connect those loose ends, and think in terms of how can you actually make it better, and what are the functions that are not fulfilled, and how can you make it better by actually connecting what is out there. And I think if we can do that, then the value proposition of having an ODI network, or whatever term you use, can be made stronger, and can also actually already be implemented much quicker, as opposed to start thinking about, well, we need to have a new institute and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But
So
think
different
more in
people
platform
are-
as opposed to institutionalization.
So can I just come back to that? So the reason for arriving, these are all very formative thoughts, the kind of 3-tier engagement structure is one, that there's a very fast to engage, but a fail fast way of beginning and maybe ending, actually, against certain criteria. So we get out of the way as quickly as possible for people who are already doing this, but we help to just put a little network connection in. The idea that some centralized, or like kind of center for a country, which might require millions of dollars worth of funding, is also an interesting question. Right? But that's a much longer time horizon than just saying, what can we do in the next 3 to 6 months, which is the time frame we're looking at.
Let's
Against
move on
the
to
functions that you want to fulfill. Right.
let's move on to Evan Tribune.
I'd like to jump past the process of establishing an open data institute or the equivalent organization and go ahead to the end user. I was really taken with your reference to data literacy and the need to focus on data literacy, because I think none of us in this room want this to be a conversation essentially elite to elite out there who don't have the technological facility that people in this room do, or access to technology, access to devices. Susan and I were talking at the break about even access to libraries. Library funding in communities all over this country has been cut by communities, cut by states, and often that's the only access point for people who are of a lower socioeconomic status, that may be their only way into getting access to this stuff. So I wonder in the UK what you're doing to make certain that this important work up here is actually migrating down to people who may not have either adequate data literacy or adequate access to devices or technology.
Okay, let me just from a question and answer to Gavin to have a little bit more discussion, because we're also going to go in tomorrow into some of the detail. But I think the point about the importance of fostering literacy is very important, and one that we have to be thinking of as a group and as we move along to address. Let's move on to Clay Johnson.
Well, I had a couple of questions, but now I won't ask them.
I would recommend that.
I'm going to wing it for a second, which is very dangerous. So, you know, I guess the title of this session is Cultural and Institutional Barriers to Open Governance,
Yeah,
right?
and the reason I'm moving it along and not having it just go back to Gavin is I wanted Gavin to set out, you know, at least one country's institution for how they're, or network, you know, how they're doing it. But then what I want to do is come back to the U.S. at the local and federal level, and, you know, we're going to bring them in and see, well, what is the milieu in the United States that you have to deal with to bring about these functions? Not even the institution, but the functions of fostering, you know, literacy or, you know, training and the various things that we're trying to achieve.
So I think that
that's the idea.
You know, if I could sort of speak specifically about what could and will cause friction and does cause friction at the federal level for the open data sort of movement, I think it really boils down to three things that really need a lot of work. Two pieces of legislation, and one just sort of common practice. The common practice is that the federal solicitation for information, like the request for comments that government asks of the public, is really terrible. Who in this room has actually submitted a comment via the Federal Register? Right, that's messed up, right? Because 100% of us should have done that. But the reason why we don't do that is because we're not sociopaths, and when we read the documents that are in the Federal Register that are asking us for information, they're insane. They're written in a language that none of us really understand, and they're designed to not actually get any feedback from the public, and it's gross. And then the two pieces of legislation are the Paperwork Reduction Act, which doesn't have an equivalent in any other nation on the planet, but basically it prevents government from asking the public questions without a minimum of a 60-day notice, a minimum of a 60-day public comment period as to whether or not it's okay for government to ask that question before it can be asked, which means oftentimes this process takes up to 6 months, and so by the time the question is even asked, it's over. And the other one is the Federal Advisory Committee Act. And what the Federal Advisory Committee Act does is it says that it's not okay for government to get more than, I think, 9 people in a room and ask them to come to consensus on anything, ever, unless they are appointed and nominated to what's called a Federal Advisory Committee. And these two particular laws are really strange and arcane, and I think all need to be focusing on, like, how do we modernize them or change them. But more importantly, when it comes to the Federal Advisory Committee, you know, there's a Federal Advisory Committee on technology called PCAST. I've been to a couple of PCAST meetings, and, you know, open data is not on their radar. And, you know, it probably ought to be on their radar. It ought to be talked about a lot more. On their radar, because they are the ones that are making that can actually come to conclusions and can make recommendations to the president and to the White House about how technology moves forward. Or, you know, we ought to be saying, like, look, let's create an open data Federal Advisory Committee that's not PCAST, the Presidential Council on Science and Technology, but let's create an open data Federal Advisory Committee that advises the White House and government on these issues and has the legal ability to do so.
Okay, those are some great suggestions. But just do a little reaction. I'm sort of in the policy area. The very first one, the Paperwork Reduction Act, that's really to keep the government from being a burden on people. But what you're pointing out is that there are instances where the government is asking for information.
I would actually point out that the GAO came out with a report last year that said that the reduction on burden hours to the public has not gone down since the invention of the Paperwork Reduction Act.
I'm not surprised. So, but the point is, even if with that goal, you could separate out the function, one, to pull in comments on issues as opposed to imposing paperwork, which was what their original goal, may not even achieve what their original goal was.
Has not achieved.
Has not achieved. But, you could separate out those functions. That's very good. And the second one on the PCAS, which is the Presidential Council for Advice on Science and Technology, I think we can actually work on that. We've got ins to the PCAS and can really, I think, get this on their agenda. Let's move to Ellen Miller. Can you
You asked a really good question, I think, earlier, Charlie, so we don't have to go back and forth directly with Gavin, about what needs to be done, what's missing in the U.S. in particular, and are there functions, I think the implied question is, there are functions from ODI that we need to have done here. What needs to be done is we need to ask. So Sunlight's been involved in municipal open data work for exactly 6 months. And we're now supporting 30 cities because we asked, what can we do? How can we help? Do you want to look at the early open data standards that we developed? Here's what we have. Here's what it could mean in terms of implementation. And I think we are only limited at the moment by the number of people we have actually working on that. So just asking and providing information. I mean, there's been a lot of standards work done in the U.S. and with the W3C, and lots of people are doing it. We're doing it globally as well. Training, lots of training being done by a number of organizations in terms of how to use the data sets, lots of advocacy being done at all levels of government. So I think that's why I liked Michael's map initially. So what's out there, what is being done, and then checking in with communities with what else they need. And because there might be some real collaboration that could be in play. And my question, I think, is, and both Clay and Greg might have some comment on this, in terms, because of their Sunlight experience. When we go out to a community, and it's much easier to work at the municipal level than it is the state level, than it is the federal level, trying to understand whether the standard and the actual implementation has to be identical across all of these, whether they all need a certificate per se that says, yes, you're doing it right. Is there only one right way to release data? And I don't really personally know the answer to that, but I think that's something we might want to wrestle with. And I don't know whether ODI has wrestled with it in terms of its certification or not.
Can I comment back? There's two comments I've got. One is one of our key functions is to stimulate demand. So the experience we had in the UK is government from top down said, publish. All the departments then said, why? Right, so there wasn't a kind of closed loop there. It was like, publish and they will come. Now we know that doesn't work. So in terms of how do we stimulate demand, all of the things you mentioned are really important. Building capabilities, training, finding out what are the actual needs. But people don't know how to ask the question yet on a lot of those pieces. On the standards, on the open data certificates, all of the development that we've done, we do in the open from the very first line of code. And within a week or two of even starting the development a few months ago, all of this is done on GitHub. Someone had forked it into Russian. Someone had forked it into 3 other languages. So we went, okay, well, let's just pre-generate the rest of the countries in the world, and then people can come in and edit and make them specific to those territories. So dealing with this, how do we deal with Taiwan, Singapore, Liberia, want to copy these models, but they have to be able to adapt them for local needs. So what we've created here is something that is not an export model, it's a copy and adapt model, but it's, again, joined at
But she asked the
heart.
question of, is it important to have a uniform standard across? And just quickly, what's your answer to that?
So I think there are certain things which are, we need to know what the URL is, what are the licensing conditions. Now, these are not exactly what is the license, but what are the licensing conditions? How do we reference them in a machine-readable way? Who owns the data? How do we contact people? These are macro generic
Those aren't
questions.
data publishing standards. I totally agree with those basic user-focused kinds of questions, and I think that's great. My question is there a best way? Is there an only way to publish data?
No.
So
I
let's,
think no is
And do you endorse that?
endorse that there isn't one.
Correct.
There isn't one size that fits
Okay.
all.
We just did.
let's move on, and
That's
because what I'm going to
backwards
do, get Michelle and Katria, and then I want to get to Bryan, but I also, before Bryan, if I could, I'd like to bring in Story Bellows and talk about the cultural environment that we face when we look at the local level, and then Bryan, I'd like to have you talk about the federal level. You can get in your other comment at that time as well. Michelle.
I wanted to speak to data sets specifically. Some of them, I think the most successful data sets we see out there always have a component. So there's the data itself that's released, and then there's a really robust developer community and a data owner that's in conversation. So that can happen on a Google group, through any other means. But I think when you look at consumer applications, you measure success not necessarily just by the number of users, but by metrics such as 7-day actives. So how many people are coming back within 7 days, or how many people are coming back within 30 days. When you publish a data set, it's not sufficient to say, oh, we have 15 data sets available or 430 data sets available. How many of those data sets are being actively consumed? How many of those have an active developer community around it? How often are they updated? I think those are really key pieces in evaluating the success of a data set. When it comes to, and I'll just make a big jump here because I don't know how to connect them, cultural institutional barriers. I think we hear a lot of great stories, as someone mentioned, just kind of piecemeal and spread out throughout this community. Things like Mark Head had published a draft data spec on Google Documents and made it available for public comment. So anyone could come and say, this format won't work for me, or this is a better way to do this. We talk a lot about open gov learning from the technology world, open technology. Something that happens quite often in the technology world is people move around. So you move from organization to organization, you take best practices and lessons and that energy from place to place. And you might be surprised if someone stays in a role for 4 or 5 years. The average tenure might be closer to 1 or 2. In government, you have the complete opposite. The default is to incentivize people to stick around and end up with a pension after 20 years. I think some of the most exciting people in government have either moved departments or come in and out of government, people like Mark Head, people like Brett moving from the police department to technology. I think that is an important flow of people and of ideas that needs to happen if we're going to be able to spread, to cross-fertilize between levels of government and also from government to government.
Okay, Katria.
Thank you. I wanted to briefly address the fact that, or my opinion, that not all municipalities are the same, so we should really take size into account. There are specific barriers faced by small communities that are not as large barriers to larger communities. So I'm very interested in Story's presentation about how Philadelphia has dealt with things, but 3 definite barriers I've seen in small towns, rural Alabama, Texas, is that the size means fewer resources, and those resources include things like time and knowledge. It's not necessarily money. You might have a webmaster in a small community. You don't have a chief data officer. You don't have a tech staff that can own and operate open source apps that other cities found successful. You have Earl, and he knows how to get Windows started on your machine when it crashes. We have to take that into account, I think. The second barrier is that I think this is getting a little bit away from the definition of open government that we've been using. Open data is part of community self-organizing. But one of the barriers as a small community is that the government doesn't really see the need to help citizens, help residents self-organize, because it's not their job, and they have not a lot of time and not a lot of resources. So why would they spend their finite time and resources making it easier for citizens to self-organize themselves? And also in those communities, you have fewer private organizations coming in to meet those needs, to help citizens self-organize, because it's just not great monetarily to work with a small town in rural Texas. And then the third barrier I've seen was that nothing prevents a small town from adhering to open data standards, but nothing encourages it. Nothing requires it. There's no penalty if they don't, and then we don't help them facilitate. We just say, hey, this is a great idea. If they hear it, that's fine, but there have been a lot of great precedents in policy, things like the Department of Homeland Security's mandate that communities shall mitigate risk and plan for disasters. And because there's a harsh penalty, people do it. And because they provide grants specific to meeting those requirements, people actually do it, right? So I think small communities need a special look and a helping hand in some of these things.
Okay, excellent. Alec, can we go to the local beer? So Story Bellows with the city of Philadelphia will now talk about the large. I think that was a great segue into cultural barriers, because we've addressed the smaller cities. Now we've got the larger city.
Thanks. So I am one of those people that Michelle talked about who has recently come into government. It's not where I intend to stay forever, but I'm trying to work on the culture change. I think that was the piece that most interested me about coming to work in a city. And one of the things that I want to preface this is that I have found more amazing, inspiring potential allies in the city than I ever would have expected. And I found them in really weird places. And we found that by asking them to be collaborators really early on and figuring out how we can take on some of the risk associated with innovation and trying new things. I think risk is one of those key words that we absolutely have to address. And we want to figure out how we can make government more tolerant of risk. And that definitely does not mean in the city of Philadelphia empowering 26,000 people to start doing things their own way and start taking new chances. I think government is risk averse for a lot of really good reasons. And it's generally to protect taxpayers, to ensure that we don't have corruption, things like that. So when we talk about risk in government, I think we need to think about where being risk averse is actually benefiting the public, and then how do we create sort of pockets of space where risk can be adopted and aggregated and really supported. In Philadelphia, this happens in a number of different places. We have the Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics, which was created, I came to Philadelphia about 1.5 years ago. It took us about 9 months to get an executive order signed, because there were many people inside city government who were like, what is this foreign body? Our job is to expel that as quickly as possible. And it was like banging our heads against the wall. And I know we've talked about Marquette a number of times, and I guarantee you Marquette has banged his head against a wall a ton too. When we talk about open data and like the value of that and the number of data sets that are released, I think that's fantastic, but I think we need to shift that to the impact of those data sets. And all too often, I think city government is kind of like a university, where people are somewhat decentralized. You have a lot of protection in terms of your employment. And so we can have a super supportive mayor who wants to publish every data set, but when you find people in certain offices or certain departments, they can pose roadblocks at every level of government. And so while we've released the data set of where the golf courses are in Philadelphia, and I'm a golfer, so I think that's great, we don't have salary data. We don't have budget data. All of these things that I think are real, and Marquette has it, but it's a matter of trying to convince these other people that this is really something that needs to be put forth. And so I think we need to figure out ways that we can support the Marquettes of the world in making really compelling arguments as to why the public is requesting this data, so that it doesn't become just this opportunity for an internal conversation, which all too often it is. So one of the things that we've tried to do in terms of culture change in Philadelphia, and that's been really successful for us, is getting external validation for the work that we're doing. The best day for us in the city of Philadelphia was the day that we were named a top 20 finalist for the Bloomberg Mayor's Challenge. We had been these crazy people with a crazy idea about connecting entrepreneurship and procurement reform, and everybody thought we were nuts until Bloomberg Philanthropies came in and said, no, actually, this might be a really good idea. People who had said, we don't want to work with you, we won't meet with you, were all of a sudden, calling us, emailing us, tweeting at us, saying, like, we're really psyched about this. How can we participate in the city? And those were not necessarily we brought in the people from procurement who, it turns out, those like strange bedfellows are people who do really want to collaborate, and they are excited about having someone to sort of take on the risk that's associated with trying something new. And who knows how successful we'll be. I think through redefining problems and packaging those as opportunities for entrepreneurs, we're trying to get the culture of city government to not require that everybody speak our language, but that we learn to speak the language of entrepreneurs, of regular people, so that we can say, okay, here's our problem. It's not siloed in one department, but we're dealing with public safety, and there's a certain area where we have a huge spend, and we need entrepreneurial ideas, and we need companies to start to invest there the way that happens in traditional tech or healthcare startups in that world. So we're trying to create a space for government to play a lead role in creating those new partnerships that allow entrepreneurs to actually work with the city. But that requires this cultural change internally, and it requires us being okay with working with the people who want to work with us. We say there's a coalition of the willing, and we don't need to deal with the 70% of people who are somewhat ambivalent, or the 10% of people who are actively trying to dispel us. There is that 15% of people who do want to work with us and are willing to front some of their political capital in order to take on some of this risk of trying new ways of solutions.
Story, you're in the mayor's office, right? So the mayor has and I'd like to hear, it seems to me you've got that backing at the key level. And it's something I'd like to, as we go along, and I do want to call on some of the federal people, of, what is the importance of buy-in at the very top and at the different levels, buy-in at the top and buy-in at the bottom.
Buy-in at the top is necessary. And we had the mayor say to us, if you guys don't fail, you're not trying hard enough. But buy-in at the top is not sufficient.
Good. Let me get some of the people. I've got a couple of cards up. And Alec, did you want to address this? I'm still... Yeah, okay. So Alec Ross, who recently left the State Department. Was not a lifer.
That's right. So I actually take a fairly dark view of what the potential is for open data in the executive branch for Obama's second term. I actually think that if you polled the 200 most powerful members of the Obama administration and asked them a very simple binary question, should the default setting for government information be opened or closed? Question mark. I bet 100 would say open, and I bet 100 would say closed. And I think that that's really interesting, and I think that it poses some interesting challenges for this group. I think first, some very important points have been made throughout the morning about the importance of language, and I think that a lot of what I've seen over the last 4 years in the administration is this whole concept of open data. The understanding of it and its brand within the administration has changed somewhat. And I think we need to acknowledge that there are vast swaths of the executive branch that I think are very relevant and potentially important actors in the open data movement. Areas like law enforcement, for example, who view the concept of open data as implicitly negative. And I think it's been colored by WikiLeaks. I think it's been colored most recently by Edward Snowden. And I think there is a conflation of, there's a conflation of people who believe in the free flow of information, conflate that with whistleblowing. Others who don't concede the point that any of these activities are whistleblowing, but it's simply taking secret information and unleashing it. But I think the net effect of this is I actually think that the culture within the administration is not particularly fertile for advancing the open data initiative beyond a handful of places. Now, there's some very important places. HHS, of course, is an exemplar of this. OSTP is a terrific advocate and sort of steward of the open data movement within the administration. But I think it's an interesting challenge for us to think about how can we broaden the understanding, and by broadening the understanding of what open data really is, broadening its appeal. Yeah. Because I do think that, here, if you poll all of us, well, you say, well, of course the default setting for government information should be open as opposed to closed. But we can't take for granted that not only is that not the majority view, but actually the people who actually control most of the power are increasingly antagonistic to the notion of the loss of control that comes with giving up access to your information. So it's sorry for being so sort of exceedingly realpolitik.
No, it's a very good point.
But it's the world that I've come from, and so I would love for some of the synthesis, particularly the synthesis that takes place in the working groups this afternoon, to focus on, vast swaths of the federal government that view this as inherently antagonistic, but if they embraced it, would create really powerful, important citizen-centered tools.
Great. I'm going to call Sivak and Kathy Conrad, who are two people in the government who are dealing with this, the federal government. Then I'm going to come back to the local with Brett and Greg.
So I have a million things to say about this, but I'll try to keep it to just about 5. First of all, Story, one thing I would actually disagree with you on is that I don't think that it's okay for government to be risk adverse. In fact, I hate the term risk adverse. I think government should be risk aware, right? Meaning that in any given circumstance, an individual or a group should try to figure out what the true risk of any decision is and then make a decision based on that true risk. And in some cases that might mean saying no. In some cases that might mean saying yes, right? But the idea of risk aversion as sort of a general philosophy, I don't agree with. So that's first thing. Second thing, the original comment I was going to make, which kind of ties into a lot of this stuff, is to Gavin. And I think the work that you're doing is crucially important for one main reason from the government perspective, which is that it's all too easy for the gains that have been made in these areas to be sort of thrown away, right? On the local level, so in DC, DC is an interesting example because DC started doing open data in 2004, really. So long before anybody even started thinking about open data. And the reason they did it was because the mayor before the mayor right now, Anthony Williams, wanted to do things like start to measure crime statistics and start to measure statistics internally to keep his agencies, or to manage his agencies, right? And so there was a value for the agencies themselves in actually publishing this data and putting it out there. And then over the course of that administration and over the course of the Fenty administration, it sort of blossomed into this whole program. Unfortunately, when the new administration took over, it all disappeared. The whole idea of the CapStat program, the whole idea of this dashboard that we launched called Track DC, nobody paid attention to it, nobody cared, and they stopped being updated, and it just sort of withered on the vine and died, even though it was a good idea. On the state level in Maryland, you have a governor who is 100% about data-driven decision-making. And when it came time, we kind of pushed the idea of putting up a data warehouse and opening up some of the state data. And there was a lot of hesitance from inside the organization, but the the governor, because he actually came to a meeting and said, this is what you will do, right? It actually cut through a lot of that stuff. And so we managed to get something going there. Now, in the federal government, at HHS, we have spent the last 3 years pushing this idea of open data in a very, very significant way, with complete buy-in from the secretary and the deputy secretary. And it's been a long, hard road, right? But we have, I think, very successfully changed the default setting of this idea of opening data from closed to open in most circumstances. There are still some notable recalcitrant holdouts, but every day that's changing, and there are people that we are sort of addressing in certain ways to kind of change that idea. But the thing is, and I was thinking about this the other day, if the administration disappeared tomorrow, if Kathleen Sebelius and Bill Corr quit their jobs and went back to where they came from, there is zero guarantee that the open data program at HHS would continue, even though we've built an ecosystem around this. We had a conference in DC 3 weeks ago where 2,000 people showed up to do nothing but open data, to talk about nothing but open data. But even though there is that ecosystem, I can't guarantee that it would not continue. For the sole reason, I'll give you a perfect example. There's a data set that we release. One of the things we do is certify electronic health record systems for what we call meaningful use. And we keep a constantly updated database of which systems have been certified, which physicians, which hospitals have these systems. And we have pledged publicly that this database will be updated on a quarterly basis and posted in machine-readable format on a very specific website. And it took a guy named Fred Trotter, who I'm sure some of you here know, to basically call us out on not updating that data set since Q3 of last year or something, right? And this is in an agency where all we think about in a lot of ways is open data and putting this stuff out there. So I think that organizations like ODI and the push that you guys can bring to the table to keep this movement going is going to be critically important as these administrations start to change and as these ideas start to start to take root, because it's just far too easy for a new person coming in to say, yeah, it's a good idea, but that's not really my thing.
Yeah.
So
I think the point of resilience and sustainability, and particularly sustainability, is really important. I think you showed the example of Washington D.C., which is and then what's possible. Let me move to Kathy Conrad from U.S. General Services Administration.
Thanks. So let me try to pull together some of the things that Story said with some of the concerns that Alec raises, and I agree, Bryan, with your characterization of the vulnerability of the momentum that's been built. I think at the federal level, as at the city level, having executive level leadership and policy mandates has been absolutely critical. So the fact that now open data is essentially mandatory is absolutely essential to being able to get more agencies to follow on the heels of HHS. That said, until you can get agreement and buy-in at the sort of management level of dedicated career folks who, I would echo Story's experience that since I've come into government, I've been overwhelmed by the number of truly passionate, dedicated, incredibly smart people who are really trying to do great things. So having that policy driver is critical, but then you need to be able to connect with the people at the career level who are delivering services and make it clear how opening up data contributes to the delivery of their mission. And I think that's where having more intersections between some of the organizational silos that prevent that mission delivery impact from being visible and discussed and sort of leveraged is really important. I think organizational silos are often thought about at the federal level as between agencies and even within agencies, but the organizational barriers that exist between different levels of government need to be broken down in order to have that mission impact more clearly leveraged so that we can have the kind of institutionalization and sustainability that can overcome shifting political dynamics.
Okay, very good. Let's move back to these, and Brett Goldstein, who's from Chicago.
So I've I guess, two things at this point. Sort of thinking about what Bryan said about sustainability. There's no magic to keeping it on, but I think there are ways that you can make it hard or harder to turn it off. Part of that is automation and ETLs. Sorry, Charlie, again. Making it so, in my use case, we made it as automatic as with little blocks of code that just did the work, so that they're actually kind of hard to find to turn off. So if someone comes in and says you need to turn it off, it's not that easy. Two, and this is sort of one of the things I think we all worry about, the more people that use the API, the noisier it gets if something goes off. I've gotten a series of, let's just say, angry calls if an ETL did break. And that's great, because that makes it hard to shut down. But I think there are ways that we can sort of chip away at that risk. Now, going back to story, which was the main reason to talk, I'm puzzled by our different experiences. Because if you ask me the question straight out, what do you need to be successful in open data? I would have said, 1, you need a strong executive sponsor. 2, you need a technologist like Mark, like me, to make sure it happens, to call, we're live streaming, to call BS on, hey, it's hard to get at that data. Oh, well, let's look at it together. Let's look at the tables. Let's look at how we can get out and have a platform, which we both have. The experience that I had was when Mayor Emanuel said, we are going to do this. That was the end of the discussion. And my job was to go through and ensure that any sort of barrier, any sort of, it's an old system. If you run SQL against it, it will fall over. Well, that's not good, but we can still do it. So I'm puzzled by the different experience. You know, of course there is resistance. You know, I think I found, like, thinking of salary. Salary is always an interesting case, but I would argue, well, it's subject to FOIA. Isn't it a lot easier, and aren't we actually saving the city money? Because how silly is it that back in the day, if we were releasing salary data, we'd take it from whatever, we'd push into a PDF, it would go to, I think, the FOIA would be from BGA, they'd then pay someone to type it in, and that's, yeah, and
It's the Bowling and Golfers Association.
yeah. Well, people know how much I love golf. So those were the types of things, but those were in fact small barriers. So I'm puzzled.
Okay.
You said you're going to share ingredients, and I got strong executive sponsor, technologist to call,
Yeah.
and another technologist.
I think a platform.
It's the strong executive, the technologist, and a platform. Yeah. And that's why I think there's a great thread that, you know, we could always talk about CCAN in a box. How do we make it really easy? Secreta, you don't have to. But how do we lower the barrier there? Between Secreta and CCAN, you can just have what you need. But those are, in my experience, the 3 pieces you need to just get it going.
Okay. Let's go to Greg Ellen from Get Machines.
Yes, but with a number of years' experience inside the federal government, and I think you know, what we're talking about is familiar with the question of back in the early 90s of why do we need a website inside of an enterprise, and then it was why do we need to do wikis, and won't wikis be a problem? There's always this. You were always in transition with these references, and I think the big one that we have right now is with government is a paper bureaucracy versus a networked digital bureaucracy, and we're in transition from a government that's been based on paper bureaucracies to a bunch of people in the world who are trying to do things through a more highly automated digital networked bureaucracy. And there is a bureaucracy in the digital world. If you've ever had a problem with your Google email address or an identity with someone, you encounter that bureaucracy. And I think that the Paperwork Reduction Act, or PRA, the Klinger-Cohen Act that was done in 1996, which established the CIOs in the federal agencies, and the Federal Information Security Management Act of 2002. The Klinger-Cohen Act was done in 1996 and has no reference to the internet. And the Federal Information Security Management Act has no reference to the internet. So in these very strong laws that are giving a framework for government to act, they were written at a time just before people began to understand what they could really do with the internet and what that culture looked like. So we have a huge tension between the framework that people have to operate under and what is now capable with the tools and with the evolving culture. I think when it comes to open data, if you've ever tried to, especially a few years ago, if you've ever tried to get a nonprofit to open up their data, you would encounter the exact same issues that you encounter with people in government trying to open up their data. It's the same conversation again and again. And the thing that we've learned most clearly is that it doesn't matter if the people in the 3 cubicles over have figured out open data or open government. It's the same learning curve and conversations for the next micro community. Who's going to control it? What happens? What do you mean there's going to be crowdsourcing? It's the same pattern. The argument for open data, I think, in many ways, is that if you do your data openly, you can do it on the web, and you can be a part of the web ecology that produces value that's different and of a different scale than if you're working with closed data. And it doesn't matter what type of organization you are. And I think that we believe, because of the power of open data, that similarly, if we can make governance a part of the web ecology, there will be different scale effects in different ways than what we have when we're working with closed or paper-based bureaucracies. Okay. And so the cultural difference is just a cultural difference. And it's a long road to make those changes.
But sometimes a cultural difference is just a cultural difference. It's very, it's a very large.
You're right. But I guess what I meant is that just as in minimal, that cultural differences, because right now the interesting cultural difference that's taking place is the people that want to keep using data-based CMS systems like Drupal versus people that want to use Jekyll-based static content management systems that we just saw for healthcare.gov. So even within this supposedly hip technological community, there is a big cultural war going on right now between a legacy approach to doing CMS and between the emerging new approach.
Okay.
And those battles are big.
Let me just take a break. And John Seeley Brown is across the room, and he is the outside director of something called the Center for the Edge. And a lot of the premise is that a lot of the innovation goes on at the edge. We're talking about now innovation in governance that we've just kind of agreed between Story and Brett, at least, although he suggested they disagreed, but at least they agreed that there needed to be buy-in from the executive. I think probably Story would agree to the other elements, being technologists and platform. But before the session was over, and it doesn't have to be immediate if you want to think about it, JSB, is how would you think about the ability to bring in innovation in this world, in this open data and open governance approach to large institutions such as federal government institutions, large cities? We've already seen the difference, that, there is a difference between small cities and large cities. But if you have any thoughts about how that might be approached. And just before you do say it, last year we were at a different conference where the president of Arizona State University suggested that the only way you're going to get innovation is through, it's basically building an edge building something, innovation on the edge, and then bringing it into the core at some point. So I just thought if you had any thoughts about this topic, it would be a good time to bring it in.
Just two quick comments. I'm surprised at the lack of discussion on data visualization and how you let data tell the stories for you to capture the imagination of the people at large. Because we're talking about the incredible importance of narrative. Well, data, of course, is its own narrative. If you figure out interesting ways to render it, or as Michael, who was here last year, Michael Crow, would say in the decision theaters, letting the constituents come in and actually play with the data in terms of trying out different hypotheses and so on and so forth. The other comment I make is I love this somewhat illegal comment made over here about one of the best ways we can play this game is to insert things that can't be de-inserted very quickly into the system. Because it is shocking how well that works. And we don't probably talk about it that much. But I think that there is something that really can be done with taking that idea to the extreme. Of course, understanding how to be risk aware.
Okay. Let me bring in, Kathy, you did want to address this, or did you just have your card up from before?
No, I did have another comment, which is, one of the things we really haven't talked about at all, and that really affects culture, is the whole HR process and the misalignment in incentives for both hiring and performance that are so focused on output rather than outcome. And I don't know if anybody has ideas of how that can be how that has been perhaps addressed at other levels, but we haven't really talked about it, and yet people are really the core of what makes all of this. So I hope we'll get to that at some point.
Okay. Philip, next.
So I just wanted to, riff off of some of the things Bryan was saying about sort of the evolution of some of these efforts in the municipal government, by perhaps stating the obvious, which is just the opportunity and the influence that peers have on one another around these initiatives. So, like Bryan said, I think DC government was actually, an incredible pioneer in a lot of these initiatives. And it's great to see sort of momentum continue across the ecosystem, even if they're not currently as proactive as they once were. And I think it's just important to recognize sort of how that evolves in terms of, another example is the Open 3-in-1 standard that, Bryan was a part of initially kicking off in DC and Alyssa in San Francisco. It was this, I think, awesome example of collaboration between two cities. And to a large extent, neither of those cities are particularly active pushing that. But then you have Chicago who's taking sort of leadership. And so you kind of see this kind of baton being passed with some of these initiatives in terms of some sort of being the kind of early adopter and sort of, making the right judgments on the sort of risk awareness front and allowing lots of others to be kind of second movers, which seems to be kind of a common pattern. Like there's very, to the sort of idea of the edge, there's very few people who seem to be willing to take the first step, but there is actually a significant portion of people willing to be the second adopters. And then there's still, you have a longer term tail of maybe it's smaller cities with less resources or other people who are just, take more to be convinced. But I think it's just important to recognize the power and influence of peers, both across other cities or, maybe other countries at the federal level or between different agencies, and how these networks can both help adoption, but also the resilience of the sort of larger movement carry on if you're relying too much on executive leadership in one city that is not necessarily sustainable. And obviously, like the longer term, point to focus on, as Kathy was saying, is how you can get sort of that cultural understanding at the lowest level, so that you can institutionalize things in a way that has nothing to do with the executive leadership, or get buy-in from civil society and the legislative branch, and whether that means pass legislation that's going to stick more than an executive order or something like that. So just wanted to sort of throw that out there. Building these networks, I think, is incredibly critical to avoiding those potential pitfalls.
Good. Clay.
Yeah, I just wanted to sort of stitch together a couple of narratives that I've been hearing. One is this, this sort of dissatisfaction with the sort of status quo of our community. You hear it in my comment about like what's the 5-year plan, but you also hear it in like same old tired stories of, you know, telling the stories of GPS and weather, but we don't have many other success stories to really talk about. And then I think the comments, you know, on the other side of I think that very same coin is Alec Ross's like sort of deep dark vision of the future along with Mark's, which is government doesn't really want to be open. And I think part of the reason behind that is because we do a lot better of a job with telling the stories of like how open data is going to send the bad guys to jail than we do on the economic impact of open data and how government can be open. You know, if Gavin's presentation leads with a $300 million potential cost saving, I'd be eager to see whether or not government actually did anything to do those cost savings. You know, that's the other half of that coin. But I think that that's an interesting sort of, that those are two, we're basically saying the same thing there, right? And that I think the result, the outcome of those conversations are, look, we need to be telling the sort of the economic success stories of open data a lot better. And I think, you know, we've gotten ourselves into sort of a little bit of a hole here in that the largest of the organizations around open data, and I think where a lot of open data's roots are around watchdog organizations rather than around economic development. And it's probably important that we really do a much better job of while that stuff is important, of also telling the stories of economic development. I know from my term in the White House that, yeah, people were like, why would I open my data so that I could invite a whole bunch of people to tell me how to do my job? That seems ridiculous. I already have a boss.
Clay, it's even worse because not only is it invite people to tell me how to do my job, but that they might actually, find some problem or embarrass me.
The number, like, especially in procurement, like, people will say, like, well, I can't do that because I might go to jail. Alyssa was in a meeting with me where, you know, people were like, and, you know, I basically said, well, is there a procurement prison where, you know, you didn't dot the I's and cross, let's let those people out. Let's issue some pardons for the people that were, you know, risk takers for technology and procurement. But, you know, I guess the last thing I want to say is to Greg's point is that, yes, it is a cultural issue, but culture is institutionalized inside of the federal government and is in fact legislated inside of the federal government, especially around procurement. People are afraid of going to jail, and that's because the laws make them afraid to go to jail because there are laws that they could be breaking. And it's hard for them to take risks. They're not supposed to take risks. You know, a procurement officer, a contracting officer, their job is to do the opposite of taking risks. And I would prefer us live in a society where we could encourage small risk taking and not large risk taking, or something like that, allow for risk. But it's important to realize that, you know, what starts out as cultural problems can often become institutionalized in culture and then become part of legislation and get legislated, and that gets very hard to break.
Okay, very good. What we're not a lot of time. I'm going to bring in Alyssa, who hasn't had a chance to speak at this session yet. Pick up Bryan, Ellen. Greg, is that left on? You want to speak again? Story, and finish up with Gavin, see if he has any insights for the United States. Alyssa.
I just wanted to draw attention to two kind of things that I'm hearing come out of these conversations, in addition to the federal municipal kind of differences. We're having conversations about how to move government to embrace open government, but then there's also the citizen side, and that's a lot of the hardest challenge that I'm doing now outside of government is how do I get residents to embrace open government and open data at the individual level. So not necessarily developers that are using the open data, but how do I get residents engaged in that process? And so there's two conversations that I think we can have with the same goal in mind, but there's two kind of different groups that we're trying to shift, that it require cultural shifts.
Right. Or did you not want to?
Just really quickly, I wanted to kind of echo what Kathy Kathy said. All of this stuff, all of the idea of government employees doing interesting things or taking risk or trying new stuff comes down to this idea of a lack of incentives to do any of these things. And that all has its origin, sort of to what Clay was saying, in this bizarre amalgamation of rules that have cropped up decades and centuries in some cases. And HR is a lot of points where it starts, right? Because I have this fundamental philosophy that the key asset of any organization is the people that make it up. I don't care what sector or what you do, product or service. It's all about the people. And in the federal government, we managed to basically F that up from day one by getting all of the wrong people in all of the wrong jobs. And then we progressed messing it up from there with a terrible performance management system that does nothing to manage any kind of performance, which leads us to the point where we can't get rid of anybody who should be gotten rid of because there's nothing to get rid of them over. And so I really believe that if we go back to the basic fundamental problem of getting the right people in the right jobs and then figuring out how to motivate them correctly and provide them the right incentives, then we actually could go a long way to solving all of these problems, not just the open data problem.
Okay, Ellen?
Just a couple of points. I want to second Alex's view of the federal government. I'm surprised this number was 50-50 of the
Right.
that
He was being
people
kind.
who want to open up data and those who don't.
He was a diplomat.
He is a diplomat.
He's a diplomat.
That's the difference between Alec and Ellen. The one important thing to underscore here, and it also comes from Bryan's comments, is that if we don't do the policy work, is that will ultimately require government's data to be open as a public good, if for no other reason, only as a public good, then we're going to constantly be scrambling, as Bryan suggests, like, oh my God, we have a really different administration here, and we have just lost 10 years worth of work. And I don't know does anybody here do policy work besides Sunlight? I mean, we do it at the federal level. We're working with citizen groups at the state level. We dive into something in California. We dive into something in Utah to provide the kind of expertise and policy guidance to make gains and stop losses. And so I think that's a hugely missing, and not to mention frustrating and very difficult and long road of what we have to do in the U.S. to make sure that the gains we have and the projections where we want to go are actually staying in the same, that we're moving forward in this.
Good. Great.
I just wanted to echo what Bryan was saying in terms of people and how important that is. I think we haven't seen many instances where we're seeing a critical mass of people inside a government agency, outside a government agency, and with the stakeholders who are all on the same page about these tools and open government and open data. What we often have is we have a couple individuals who are there as change agents, whether it's the Code for America folks or it's the CIO. So we haven't really seen a case where you suddenly get a whole stack of people in one place and what kind of change that out. And I think so as an obstacle, we're sending small foraging small parties into the wilderness to try to make change, and we haven't had an opportunity where we sent an entire troop to capture land. And so I wanted to offer that as a possible point to think on.
Metaphor, yeah. I'm going to finish up with Story. Let me call on Panthea, then we'll finish up with Story and Gavin Starks. And before I get to Gavin, I want to do a little summary and then have you comment. Panthea.
Just one quick point on the policy comment. So I think we spend a fair amount of time sometimes sitting in government offices talking to civil servants that end up having to implement policies that get handed down. I think sometimes some of the challenges that we see there are, people feel very frustrated, right? So, there has been this policy established, but, or, handed down, but suddenly, I have to process these FOIA requests, and I have my day job, my regular sort of scope of work that I actually had to do. Things that are now coming in with, they were developed without considering adequate capacity, or, I have not been trained to do this new thing, and they're bringing in all these new people that don't understand the politics of how this place works, and I think there's a bit of ego involved there as well. And I think so, I think, Ellen, I think you were saying earlier, embracing the human-centered design aspect for citizens, but I think there's something interesting there around embracing it for policymakers as well, thinking about the people that will actually have to implement that and what that looks like, because we often talk to a lot of frustrated civil servants.
Story?
It seems like when we talk about open government and open data, it leads to this cycle of changing what the role of government actually is, and then that feeds into the need or the utility of more open data. Yet we have, I think one of the places where we need to go is to figure, if we can tell those stories of the quality of life improvements or the delivery of service improvements that we have made to the citizens, so that we start to talk about sustainability and we get to the same kind of conversation where, in an election you have to talk about arts, you have to talk about education, you have to talk about public safety. I think we need to figure out how we can create the conversation where people understand what open data and what transparency actually means for citizens and for the delivery of services. And right now, I just think it's a little bit too abstract and far removed from the people who are ultimately putting those elected officials in place who create the culture that we're all living by.
Great. Let me just a bit of a summary, and Gavin, then come back to you in terms of your advice for us. We've talked about the importance and advantages of open data, and Ellen, I was taken by, we just have to step back and say open data is a public good, but there are also narratives and arguments and cases to be made of why it's advantageous, and I know you understand that. And Clay pointing out the economic advantages, and somebody else who did that, is, I think, very important, especially at a time when we are, have limited resources. I mean, the UK government gave Open Data Institute $15 million, not billion.
That'd be nice.
Billions and billions, but they gave them millions of dollars. We don't see that happening right now in the United States or in individual jurisdictions. The point is that it can save money. It can, through more efficient services or through economic development or through other means. That's not the only value. There are other values. And essentially, I like the idea that there should be a movement for open data. We've also in this session looked at the barriers, and there are, we've kind of looked at it different ways. Some are, just that, cultural barrier. We've called them cultural barriers. The antibodies, stopping something that's new. But there are also these concerns, do people within government, it does come down to people, and do people within government, do they want to be exposed in one form or another? And there's some natural tendencies that are going to be against it. I like the ideas that came out for how to overcome that. And Brett just gave us 3, but there are many others. But the top, the leadership at the top. I think Story pointed out you also need buy-in at the bottom. And I think we all understand we're going to need citizen involvement to demand it. You need the technology, and we're strong around this table in the technology, so we tend to foster that. But Brett also pointed out that the technology can help towards the sustainability as well, which is a very important question. Not only to get it in, but how to sustain it and how to grow it. And the platform is so important. And long term, we're going to need platforms and networks really to reinforce this movement. And then in the end, it does come down to people. A number of people raised, who are the people and how do we get them? And what are the measures? Kathy brought it out. What are the measures that we take to bring in the right people and to maintain and have them accountable? But you know, we often find that whatever the question is, we can do it in the technology, but it's culture and people who actually will make it happen and make it last over time. Gavin, you suggested there be a network of open data, an open data information or institute network. But you've heard a lot about the U.S. You probably knew a lot of it, but maybe got reinforced or maybe some new ideas. What are your thoughts now in terms of where we might move?
Great. Well, firstly, I found it really inspirational hearing the stories because the challenges are not dissimilar around the world, and I think collectively we can really learn and work together to try and solve a lot of them. I think there's a few things that give me a lot of confidence, and there's a few things that act to counter that. One is that certainly in the UK we have open as the new default, so every government data set is meant to be open government licensed by default, and you have to apply to have something else. We also, to backfill some of the narrative, the Open Data Institute, we formally started the 1st of October last year, but it took years to get there, and in fact it took a change of government as well, and the ODI was originally signed off under a Labour government and then signed off again under a Conservative government, so quite how Nigel achieved that, you can quiz him tomorrow, but I think it's quite an astonishing outcome. But what that really spoke to, I think, for me, is that there is an underlying set of values that does apply to everyone. Now, when we then try and match that against what happens when you start to talk to people, so the common thing is we hear from everyone, public sector, private sector, doesn't really matter. The sky will fall in some way. And if you want to make a civil servant turn white, sit them down and say, we expect to fail 90% of the time because, we're a startup, we're trying to help. This edge innovation piece is exactly what we're trying to do, and I've turned many civil servants white over the last 9 months with that kind of statement. But I think here there are a few material things that you can do to make sustainable, resilient systems. So one of them is have open by default policies. We provide policy consultations, so we will proactively engage with people. So two extremes, one working with the postcode address file in the UK, so the address file is probably going to be privatised along with the postal service. We thought that was a bad idea, so we've lobbied hard against that. Whether or not we've succeeded, I doubt, actually, so we may fail on that. Another one was working with the Department for Education, who wanted to open up all the education records for every school kid. So we said that would be a bad idea, because personal data is not open data. Please make this clear. So I think there's a few different areas there. One is in procurement, and procurement as a tool here. So we have injected open data by default into contracts for all government procurement on IT. So service level agreements, contractual terms, performance against service level agreements, any derivative data that is produced by a contractor, open by default. So these are things that you can build into a more pervasive and resilient system. Coming back to the, John made a point about data visualization as well. One of the courses that we launched, data visualization, understanding the language around that, building capabilities. So when I kind of look at this then, how do we build a network of nodes, as I like to call them? I think there's a huge opportunity because we are, I think that the general trend is that open is the new default, but there are still a tiny microscopic number of people, many of them in this room, actually who are capable of pushing that agenda forward and doing the work. So if we're going to build our troops, I can't remember who was it said about building troops, I think it was Greg maybe, what does that look like as a distributed network? So how can we corral people from Code for America with My Society, with the domain experts in Estonia, within Sweden, within Singapore, to really make sure that we solve some of the ubiquitous challenges around how do we write CCAN in a box, how do we help Open Knowledge Foundation to achieve greater penetration. But I think there are some systemic things that we can work on together and then deal with the local issues at a more granular level.
Okay, great. We're going to break for lunch now. After lunch, we'll meet back here and go into the working groups. And the working groups is the real guts of this conference. We have 3 different groups. We have handed out a sheet where we have initial assignments. That is not, it's just a way of moving us along quickly and making sure we have the similar size working groups. If you want to change, please see Tricia Kelly, and we'll try to exchange so we kind of keep the quality of the groups similar. They get into providing government services in terms of citizen interactions with government and with the use of data in the private sphere for public good. As I said, we'll come back and look at and we'll get our charge to the working groups. You also should have in front of you a green sheet. That green sheet will have all of your contact information. The idea is that we don't have to each hand out cards, that we will give everybody the contact sheet at the end of the conference. So please fill out what part of the information you want others in this group to have to contact you. Lunch is at the Meadows Reception Building. We meet back here at 2 o'clock, and a great morning. Thank you.
Can we leave our stuff?
Oh, yes, you can leave your stuff, and for the online audience, we will start again tomorrow morning, 8:45 Mountain Time, 10:45 Eastern Time. Thank you.